October 1943, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The air is thick with the smell of ozone, diesel fuel, and the metallic tang of welding arcs. World War II is raging across two massive, blood-soaked oceans, and the United States military is bleeding heavily. The Atlantic is swarming with invisible wolf packs of German U-boats, and the Allies are desperate for any technological edge, any scientific breakthrough that can finally defeat the Axis powers. According to one of the most enduring, terrifying, and widely debated legends of the 20th century, the US Navy actually found that edge. They just couldn't control the horrific dimensional forces they unleashed. The story claims that the USS Eldridge, a newly commissioned, state-of-the-art cannon-class destroyer escort, was selected for a highly classified black project. The ship was secretly outfitted with massive, experimental electromagnetic generators, supposedly based directly on Albert Einstein's unproven unified field theory. The goal of the project was theoretically simple but practically godlike: to aggressively bend light and gravity around the entire hull of the ship, rendering it completely invisible to enemy radar, and, more shockingly, to the naked human eye. The legend states that on a foggy, overcast morning, the massive generators were fully engaged. A strange, sickly green electromagnetic fog slowly enveloped the steel hull of the Eldridge. The water around the ship began to boil violently and crackle with intense static electricity. And then the Eldridge didn't just turn invisible, it vanished entirely from the fabric of space-time. It allegedly teleported over 200 miles away to the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia, appearing there for several minutes before violently, explosively snapping back into reality in the Philadelphia waters. But the true, visceral horror of the legend wasn't the violation of physics. It was what happened to the flesh and blood of the men trapped on board. When the ship finally materialized, the crew was found in a state of unimaginable, grotesque agony. Some men were discovered with their bodies molecularly fused with the solid steel bulkheads and deck plates of the ship, half human and half metal, screaming as their nervous systems merged with the iron. Others went completely, irreversibly insane, babbling about horrific entities they saw in the dimensional void. Some simply vanished into thin air, never to be seen again, while others suffered from a bizarre condition called the freeze, where they would temporarily fade in and out of reality for the rest of their tragic lives. It is a story of man playing God with the fundamental, unbreakable laws of the universe and paying a horrific, blood-soaked price. But where does the myth end and the heavily classified reality of the Second World War begin? The context, the real science of deception. To understand the true origins of the Philadelphia experiment, you have to strip away the science fiction, the teleportation, and the glowing green fog, and look at the very real, very urgent, and highly classified science of 1943. The US Navy was indeed running secret experiments in the Philadelphia Navy Yard to make their warships invisible. But they weren't trying to hide them from light or human eyes. They desperately needed to hide them from magnetism. German U-boats were devastating Allied supply lines using highly sophisticated magnetic sea mines. These mines sat quietly on the ocean floor and detonated not upon physical impact, but when the massive magnetic signature of a steel ship's hull passed overhead. The explosion would break the ship's keel in half, sinking it in minutes. The US Navy's desperate countermeasure was a highly classified, incredibly dangerous industrial process called degaussing. To degauss a ship, Navy engineers wrapped miles of heavy, thickly insulated electrical cables around the entire exterior hull of the vessel. They would then pump massive, lethal amounts of high-voltage direct current through those cables, effectively turning the 1,200-ton ship into a giant electromagnet. This violent electrical pulse scrambled and neutralized the ship's natural magnetic signature, making it invisible to the magnetic triggers of the German mines. Now put yourself in the shoes of a civilian dock worker, a merchant marine, or an exhausted junior sailor in 1943. The pressure of the war is everywhere. You look across the shipyard and you see a destroyer wrapped in bizarre heavy black cables, humming violently with the deafening sound of massive electrical generators. You overhear commanding officers talking in hushed tones about making the ship invisible. You see localized electrical discharges, sparks, and strange atmospheric effects like St. Elmo's fire caused by the massive high-voltage equipment in the damp air. The seeds of a legend are instantly, permanently planted. Furthermore, the Navy was actively testing new, high-frequency sonar and experimental radar jamming systems on other vessels nearby. When you combine experimental high-voltage electrical fields, highly classified military jargon, the genuine paranoid secrecy of wartime operations, and the deep psychological stress of a global conflict, the rumor mill doesn't just spin, it accelerates to light speed. The decisive stroke, the Varro edition, and the birth of paranoia. So how did a routine, albeit highly classified, degaussing procedure turn into a horrifying story of teleportation, unified fields, and men fused to solid steel? AD break. When you're telling a documentary story about government secrets, bending the laws of physics, and the terrifying unknown, the atmosphere of your edit is everything. You need audio that captures the heavy hum of high-voltage generators, the ominous creak of a battleship hull, and the unsettling dissonant tones of a reality coming entirely unglued. You need audio that captures the heavy hum of high-voltage generators, the ominous creak of a battleship hull, and the unsettling dissonant tones of a reality coming entirely unglued. That's where epidemic sound comes in. Consider it your classified, cleared archive for production assets. A massive library of high-quality, royalty-free music and sound effects. No copyright strikes to make your channel vanish. Need the heavy, rhythmic pulse of a 1940s military thriller? The frantic static of a scrambled radio transmission? Or an eerie sci-fi synth track that sounds exactly like a green, glowing fog rolling across the dark water? Epidemic Sound has the exact audio payload you need. A massive library of high-quality, royalty-free music and sound effects. No copyright strikes to make your channel vanish. Need the heavy rhythmic pulse of a 1940s military thriller? The frantic static of a scrambled radio transmission? Or an eerie sci-fi synth track that sounds exactly like a green, glowing fog rolling across the dark water? Epidemic Sound has the exact audio payload you need. Right now, Epidemic Sound is offering a free trial. Use the link in the description to secure your assets. Thanks to Epidemic Sound for sponsoring this declassification of a modern myth. Now back to the hull of the USS Eldridge and the man who birthed a legend. Use the link in the description to secure your assets. Thanks to Epidemic Sound for sponsoring this declassification of a modern myth. Now back to the hull of the USS Eldridge and the man who birthed a legend. Enter a deeply eccentric, highly imaginative, and likely disturbed man named Carl Allen, who operated under the alias Carlos Allende. In the mid-1950s, more than a decade after the war ended, Allende began sending a series of bizarre, rambling, extensively annotated letters to a prominent astronomer, writer, and early UFO researcher named Morris K. Jessup. Jessup had recently published a book called The Case for the UFO. In these letters, written in frantic handwriting, Allende claimed to have personally witnessed the Eldridge vanish with his own eyes from the deck of a nearby merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. Allende was a master storyteller. He wove together real scientific buzzwords of the era: Einstein, unified fields, electromagnetism, dimensional shifts, into a terrifying, cohesive sci-fi narrative. But the story would have died there if not for a bizarre intervention by the actual government. In 1957, the Office of Naval Research, ONR, in Washington, D.C. received a heavily annotated copy of Jessup's book in the mail. The margins were filled with notes written in 3 different colors of ink, detailing alien technology, unified fields, and the Philadelphia experiment. The Navy, strangely intrigued, called Jessup in for a meeting. Even more bizarrely, a military contractor named the Varro Manufacturing Company secretly printed a small batch of this heavily annotated book, which became known in conspiracy circles as the legendary Varro edition. When Jessup tragically committed suicide a few years later, the conspiracy community erupted. They believed the Navy had murdered Jessup to silence him, and that the Varro edition was proof the government was taking Carlos Allende's claims seriously. Jessup's death gave the frantic ramblings of a lone eccentric the permanent blood-stained veneer of absolute legitimacy. The story exploded into the mainstream. It tapped perfectly into a very specific post-war cultural paranoia. The public had just witnessed the deployment of the atomic bomb. If the government could secretly figure out how to split the atom and erase a city, why couldn't they teleport a destroyer? The revelation, the true lasting revelation of the Philadelphia experiment, is not that the United States Navy successfully teleported a ship through dimensions. It is that this specific, elaborate hoax inadvertently built the exact psychological blueprint for the entire modern conspiracy theory movement. The story of the USS Eldridge is the vital missing link between the secretive, entirely justified black projects of World War II and the sprawling, deeply paranoid mythologies of Area 51, Roswell, and omnipotent, malevolent shadow governments. It teaches us a fundamental, immutable truth about human nature. When technological advancement outpaces public understanding, the human imagination will violently, desperately rush in to fill the void with monsters, magic, and malice. We want to believe in the Philadelphia experiment because a world where the government possesses reality-bending, godlike magic is in a strange, terrifying way much more exciting and organized than the mundane, chaotic, bureaucratic truth of magnetic mines and heavy electrical cables. The USS Eldridge never left the water, and no men were ever fused to its steel hull. But the myth it spawned slipped the bonds of reality, broke the tethers of history, and sailed directly into the darkest, most enduring corners of our collective imagination, setting the stage for an era where the truth is whatever we are most afraid of.